possibly angrier, leaning into me more. He had a frighteningly calm mask covering his expression. It was as close as I'd ever gotten to being afraid of Edward. He glowered at me from behind his thick dark lashes.
"Do you want to know the real reason my mother sent me away, Bella?"
he asked in a daunting whisper. I could hear it, because he was only inches away from my face, breathing down my nose. I fought the urge to cringe away from him. I would take all his anger into myself if I could. I swallowed heavily, making his eyes dart down to my throat momentarily before flicking back up to my eyes.
"She sent me away because I murdered my father,"
he continued. I furrowed my brows, confused by his statement, because his father died in the fire when Edward was only 9 years old. I just shook my head at him. Edward was no murderer. He chuckled humorously, sending his hot breath into my face.
"It's true. I'm a fucking murderer."
He leaned back into his spot slowly, still glowering intensely at me and clenching his fists with barely controlled fury. I shook my head vehemently at his retreating form, and kept my chin up and my posture determined. He couldn't scare me away with his stories. "That's bullshit," I repeated Edward's most common saying right back to him. He sat Indian style in front of me, and the look in his eyes of pure self-hatred made bile burn up into my throat.
I may not have started the fire, but I sat back and watched him fucking burn. I didn't even try to help him.
He sneered at me with narrowed eyes.
I could have run and gotten help, but I didn't because I'm a fucking murderer.
His voice shook with fury.
And you can't love a murderer.
I always knew Edward was leaving out specific details about the fire. I never wanted to pry because I wanted him to tell me on his own terms. But this was just ridiculous. To blame himself for something so huge when he was only 9 years old. I let out a deep breath, trying to keep my determined posture. "You were just a child, Edward. You can't be held responsible," I said, firmly, staring into his eyes and trying to convey all the sincerity of that statement. Still, he grew more furious, knitting his eyebrows down lower into his eyes. He let out some kind of frustrated growl, and leaned over and snatched up my wrist that had been resting on my knee. He gripped it tightly, wrapping his long fingers around the small circumference of my wrist, glaring into my eyes as he held it over my knee. He was leaning into me again, breathing down my nose as his face grew reddened by his fury.
"You're so fucking naive,"
he spat, yanking my wrist towards him. I flew forwards toward him as he yanked me roughly, and shoved a hand out in front of me to stop from falling into his lap. The free hand met his scarred chest and nearly knocked him over with the force of it. He was pulling me closer and pushing me away all at the same time. I flicked my eyes up to his, balancing precariously on my knees, as he seethed and towered over me, still holding my wrist. I couldn't be determined anymore. By reflex, I cowered away from his hateful stare, tugging at my wrist in his grip. And all at once, his expression turned from hatred to complete and utter horror. His dark green eyes grew wide and his mouth fell open as he dropped my wrist. I fell back into my spot, bringing my wrist to my chest protectively, rubbing it soothingly, and blinking back all the tears that were fighting their way through my eyes at the sight of Edward's self-hatred. I watched as he fell back onto the mattress with a flop, and backed away from me with wide eyes.
"Holy fuck,"
he breathed, his face losing all the red fury and becoming a sickening shade pale of terror. He shook his head at me slowly, his green eyes glistening and wide.
"I'm so sorry, I didn't mean..."
he trailed off in a pained whisper. I was frozen as he crossed his legs again in the middle of the bed, propping his elbows on his knees, and dropping his head into his hands, gripping his hair with both his fists. He let out a hollow chuckle and shook his head, still gripping his hair.
"I knew I'd fuck this up."
He spoke into his lap in a pained voice that made my heart clench. I couldn't see his face because it was pointed downward, but I saw one tear fall onto his dark jeans, staining it a deep black, and glistening in the light of the bedside lamp. I unclamped my wrist and held a hand out by instinct. I couldn't bear to see Edward in pain. I hesitantly leaned over the bed and touched his knee with my hand gently, and he flinched away from it.
Just fucking leave, Isabella. I'm not stopping you.
He choked. My heart sank as the realization that he thought I wanted to leave made a lump form in my throat. I wouldn't let him push me away. I didn't care if he thought all those terrible, untrue things about himself. It didn't change the way I felt. And Edward had always stood by me when I was hurting and scared. So I lifted myself on my knees and crawled over to him, grabbing both his fists in my hands and not moving away when he flinched. I pried his fingers from his hair and gripped his warm, bare shoulders, pushing him upright. It took quite a bit of effort. He was entirely stiff, not wanting me to touch him. But I didn't care. He always held me when I cried, and nothing he did would make me go away, so I eventually pushed him straight. He kept his eyes closed as another tear trailed down his cheek. I crawled over him, straddling his lap, and threw my arms around his bare neck, burying my face in the crook of it and pressing my body against his completely. Trying to show him with my embrace how much none of it bothered me, hoping he could feel all the love I had for him. He was still and rigid for a long while as I stroked his hair softly, planting the occasional soft kiss on his neck. After what seemed like hours, I finally felt his arms move, slowly snaking around my back, as he hesitantly rested his head on my shoulder. He hugged me softly, as if I was fragile, stroking the hair that was flowing down my back.
I fucking hurt you.
He whispered in a pained voice into my shoulder. I shook my head against his neck. It hardly hurt at all. I had lived with multiple broken bones and cuts covering 50% of my body. One little wrist grab was nothing. He let out a deep breath and moved his arms from around me, gripping each of my shoulders and pushing me away from his body. I clenched onto his neck tightly, not wanting to let go, but he was stronger, finally succeeding in prying me off of it. He hung his head, his face still damp with tears and red eyes that were still pain, and reached up to his neck, gingerly removing the very uninjured wrist from around it. He brought it around him, to in between us, and began inspecting it. It appeared fine, with no apparent bruising, just a couple red marks in the shape of fingers. Edward let out a strangled, agonized choking sound at the sight of it. I snatched it from his grip, lifting it above his head, and hiding it around his neck. "It's nothing, Edward. It's not even bruised," I told him sincerely, not willing to let him expand on the painful choking sound that made my heart clench even tighter. He gazed into my eyes, looking deeply troubled and agonized.
"I'm so fucking sorry, Bella,"
he whispered, inches from my face. I smiled, and shook my head at him. "You're already forgiven." I shrugged dismissively, leaning down to kiss the trail of the latest tear. He huffed, and shook his head against my lips, pulling away, and reaching up once again to take my wrist in his hands. He brought it around his neck and looked at it again, hissing, as he fingered the slightly red marks. I grimaced, and tried to pull it away again, refusing to let him beat himself up over something so small. But he held it firmly, bringing it up to his lips, and planting soft, ginger kisses around it. I stroked his hair softly with my free hand, showing him I wasn't bothered by it in the least, and still smiling at him as he occasionally glanced into my eyes from under his dark lashes with every soft kiss he placed on the red marks. He began moving my fingers, and flexing my wrist, to check for any signs of damage. It didn't hurt one bit, all the soreness disappearing after a few minutes. Once he was done with his ministrations, he let my wrist go, giving it one last gentle stroke. He glanced down at his bare, scarred chest, and grimaced in disgust, shaking his head at it with a hateful expression, and glancing around the room, likely looking for his shirt that had been lost when he threw it across the room somewhere. The look of pain and complete disgust on his face as he looked upon his scarred form completely overcame all of my inhibitions. It was what we always did. Whenever I felt like a freak, Edward would show me his, and it always made me feel better knowing I wasn't alone. So it only felt natural for me to do the same. I had scars scattered around my stomach and ribs, from one of the few times I had attempted to escape from Phil. Glass had shattered into my flesh as I was pushed